Throughout centuries, men of law have been persistently concerned about the resolution of disputes in ways that enable society to achieve its goals with a minimum of force and a maximum of reasoning. Archibald Cox. Hello and welcome to the Dispute Management in the New World podcast. My name is Roxene Nickle, and joining me is Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Dispute Management Professional and Secretary General of the Jamaica International Arbitration Center, JIAC. Today our focus is on dispute management in the digital age. Welcome, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get right into it. Why is dispute management significant in this digital age?
In this age and in every other age, dispute management is significant because that is how you get persons to finding a way to effectively resolve inevitable conflicts, hopefully without having to resort to jungle justice, as we call it, chopping up each other, shooting each other, killing each other, and so on. And the better you're able to manage disputes, it is the better you're able to live in circumstances which are more amicable, where persons are more prepared than ordinary to speak to each other and to try to find resolutions that are in their general best interest, both as individuals and also as in the interest of the community.
Is it bringing to the fore any new issues that are of significance because of this digital age?
Even the digital space itself brings its own sets of problems. So while the digital age has been enabling in many ways, it could also be said to be disabling in other ways, in that by going online, particularly for persons who are going there in a very early way, they haven't been there, they haven't been practicing in that space, you find that persons will find issues arising which they may not have contemplated. And one of the things we know about online when you go there is that anything can happen. Service can be disrupted quite easily. For example, in jurisdictions where you have unreliable telecommunication services, for example, you can have all the best plans in the world and simply show up to find that nothing can happen. How do you then deal with a situation where you are reliant on a service to allow you to have easy resolution, only to find that the service itself is unreliable and does not work? What does that do? What does that do for somebody who needs an early resolution to be able to move to another stage? So one of the things I think that we are recognizing as we go forward is that while we recognize the value, we are also working through the kinks and trying to figure out how best to move forward with it, recognizing that as we go along, we're also discovering issues as they arise, and which will in turn have to be dealt with.
Okay. So as you work through these issues, are you seeing that more persons are recognizing the importance of dispute management at this time?
I think the short answer to that is yes. And if we were to look, for example, and think in the context of litigation, that is matters going before the courts. At the start of the pandemic, as we know it, in early 2020, the first quarter of 2020, say, when it became more and more recognized that we were having real issues, there were many persons who simply took a position that online is not for me, I haven't been there. Particularly practitioners of law, for example, who had grew up in an era where they had not engaged in any significant way with the internet and with technology enabled in that way. And believe it or not, there's still practitioners, still were anyway, practitioners at that stage who do nothing except still dictate letters to their secretaries and so on and so forth. Persons who never really engage with the technology as it developed. Now those persons, and understandably so, would have had issues going on. Plus, of course, for persons who understand that anything that goes into the online space goes there forever. You can't really get rid of it. There were persons who had noticeable and clear positions that I don't want to go there. I don't want to deal with my client business, which is confidential in that space and so on. So there were those issues. But I think as time went on and people recognized that the problems that we're having of inability to have ordinary face-to-face dialogue, inability to have ordinary face-to-face court settings and so on, there was the inevitable coming around by many persons to the fact that we have to do something We cannot simply sit by and do nothing in the best interest of our clients, in the best interest of our practices, and so on. So you have had over the time more and more persons coming online and more persons getting accustomed to the technology and working efficiently in it. And I hear from time to time practitioners say, boy, last year I knew nothing of how even to turn on a computer. Now I can.
I was just about to ask that. The changes, how the changes have affected them.
It's very significant, and in ways that some of us who have been in that internet and online space for a while would not have found as difficult to adjust to.
Dr. Malcolm, confidentiality and data protection are huge digital management issues. Do related concerns often factor in these requests? Because people want to ensure that their paperwork and whatever they're disputing is kept safe?
They factor, and perhaps we need to clarify that there are two distinct things.
Right.
Confidentiality and data protection are, while they're connected, they're distinct. So confidentiality is, we speak of confidentiality all the time as though it is something that you're entitled to as of right, and that's the end of the story. But in reality, it is not. Confidentiality arises by reference to what the parties desire, negotiate for, and very often agree to. So you and I having a conversation, for example, we may decide that that conversation should be confidential. We whisper to each other and we ensure that nobody hears it, right? Or we may determine that the conversation is of such a public nature, or that what we're discussing is of no real moment to either of us, that it doesn't matter if somebody else hears it, that we really don't mind if others hear us. But so what happens in every instance is that when you have parties to a dispute, and they're trying to resolve their matters, be it in court, in arbitration, or elsewhere, they will from time to time, and will often do, recognize whether or not they consider this to involve something that they do not want the world to know about.
Okay.
And that they only want a limited number of persons to have any access to at all. And so the confidentiality that they then determine there is as a matter of what they negotiate as between themselves, and they will then put measures in place to ensure that they're able to secure that confidentiality. Data protection, on the other hand, is something which is much broader in the sense that once you make data available, the question is how and what systems are in place in a general sense to allow for protection. In addition to which, there are laws that are passed in various countries and so on, which require that systems that are made available to persons should put in place adequate measures to protect data and to ensure that data, be it of a biometric nature or whatever the nature may be, does not readily spread beyond and go to persons who are not authorized to get it. So data protection, ordinarily you're looking at it by reference to who are the authorized recipients.
Right.
And is the process that you have put in place sufficient to ensure that the data that is made available only reaches the authorized recipients and nobody else? So those two things, though they have necessary connections, they can be considered distinct. But when we get now to the online, getting back directly to your question, when persons are concerned, are getting into processes online, they do have real concerns about, if I want confidentiality, let's assume that they want it. If I want confidentiality, how will that be secured? Do you have measures in place to ensure that the confidentiality is protected? And insofar as data protection is concerned, we're going to be making data available to you, probably by uploading documents to you and so forth. What measures do you have in place for that? And when they think of these questions, they very often frame it by reference to information which is already in the public domain that they're aware of. So for example, in a very recent case, and because it involved the region in a sense, we knew recently enough, a little while back, but still recent in recent memory, of the Panama Papers and the implications of that, where you had a couple of law firms which are operating and related trust companies and so on, that had data related to a number of persons who were their clients. And they were doing work for them, and somehow there was a leak of that information, which caused significant embarrassment across the world for a number of persons. And the question is, now that we've heard about that, how can we be assured that you're putting adequate measures in place to prevent that from happening, right? And in addition, we then go on to data protection again. In addition to the fact that persons are concerned at that level, you also have a situation where there are several governments through their legislatures that have passed laws requiring that based on the nature of the business and service that you offer, you should ensure that you have adequate policies and support mechanisms in place for the protection of data and to ensure that it does not go beyond authorized representatives. So the typical thing here, even in relation to something as easy, or what might appear as simple as passing on your name and the related data, information to other persons. Very often the requirements are you must get something in writing, you must ensure that it's properly authorized, and so on and so forth. But so what happens in every case, whether you're online or not, is that you then have to make sure that you have clear lines of communication, one, clear channels of authorization, two, and ensure that those channels are properly monitored. The persons who raise issues about online should also bear in mind that in the physical spaces, you still run the real risk as well of data being lost and data being leaked. And the truth is that long before online became prevalent, you had data and information and people going out. We know what newspapers are, for example, like.
Right.
A lot of the time things are out there and you wonder where they came from. And you hear that I have a mole or I have a source, and that source makes that information available. Where's the source? You don't know. It could have been information taken from the garbage bin or taken from somewhere because somebody carelessly left a piece of paper somewhere or something. So the measures, I think, are to be put in place properly, whether you're online or offline, for data protection and to secure confidentiality where agreed and to the extent agreed. But it doesn't change the fact, however, I think, which is that you need to recognize that there's a real need for it. That's one. And second, that wherever you are, data could be lost. So it is incumbent on the providers of services where data becomes available to them to put proper policing measures in place. And that, quite frankly, should be in place whether you're on or offline. It is true, I must add, that once you go online, the chance of the data spreading further is much greater.
Yes, it is.
Because once you go online, quite frankly, you don't ever know where the information may end. Particularly when we hear of things going to the cloud and things going all over the place. And we hear every single day in the news of systems being hacked, very often for bad purposes. You know, so there is that recognition that while it is possible, whether it is physical or online, online makes it easier for persons to get the information and for it to spread even wider in an unauthorized way.
So can I go a little further to ask, how are you putting that in place to ensure that your clients are comfortable knowing that their information won't get out there? What do you do?
Well, what you do,
reassure them?
frankly, is that you have to then engage the best professionals you can to ensure that you put the best possible systems in place. But while it is that you will do every single thing you can, the truth is that, and if we're to be absolutely honest, you can never ever give a complete guarantee to anyone that data, whether it is physical or online, can never be breached. We have seen governments breach, and we're not talking about what we call little governments. We've seen big entities having had, we just saw, for example, in the case of the US, that big pipeline hack,
Right.
where persons were able
Locked
to
down.
hack into a pipeline system and lock it down. Now, the US has all the resources that we can think of,
They
and much
do.
more than we would. Yet, nevertheless, their systems were hacked into. What that tells us is that there are persons out there who have the smarts, and many of them, that is their livelihood, where they're simply out there to try to get into systems and get information. So what you have to do on an ongoing basis is to ensure, one, that you put proper systems in place, two, that you use the best possible resources available to you and people who are there, and three, that you have ongoing audits to enable you to have a clear sense of what is happening in your organization. And those are measures that we've put in place.
Awesome. All right, we're talking about the disputes. Can you speak to probably a few common dispute management requests from domestic clients that can be effectively dealt with online?
Even litigation, quite frankly, can be dealt with online, but not through private entities, because litigation has to be dealt with through courts.
Okay.
And those matters are also dealt with online. But in a private dispute management arrangement, anything that you could think of, arbitration, mediation, conciliation, and all these things can actually be dealt with online as well. It's just a question of the systems you put in place, the capacities that you have behind it in terms of human resources capacities, and systems built out to enable for that to happen. But what we have seen coming out in this period is that we have seen a lot more persons interested in pursuing and having matters dealing with mediation because of the very amicable nature, and also because it allows people more so when relationships are, people want to retain them, to do that sort of thing. So we've seen quite a bit of mediation type requests. We've, of course, you'll never get around arbitration, and a lot of arbitration has been happening. And if you were to follow what is happening on the international scene, all the major international arbitrations globally, every single one, whatever name they may have, they have all pivoted to making online a default position almost in this time. And what has been happening is that a lot of matters that had started with the intention of being physical have ended up being dealt with online because that is all that was available. And more people are getting comfortable online, so much so that there's some processes where people are saying, even if we were to go back to having everybody being able to go face to face and everything, we don't think there's need, for example, for somebody to go to court for a case management conference to be dealt with in a physical way. Because the truth is, you're going there for something which is fairly straightforward, where there usually is not a whole lot of big argument and so on around it. And the truth is that you could as easily stay in your offices and wherever, get online, do something like that. And persons are saying that even after we go back, we're hopeful that some of these things that we have become accustomed to now doing online, we can continue because of their possibility for savings in cost, savings in time, and so on. And at the end of the day, processes should continually strive to become more efficient, should continually strive to becoming more cost effective. And if online permits that without doing injustice to the process, and without doing injustice to the needs of the parties for a fair and reasonable outcome, then we should explore it. And explore it not necessarily as an absolute unto itself, but appropriately as well, as a hybrid with physical appearances and so on, where those are necessary.
Awesome. So the requests that we have you seen a difference between the domestic and the international in terms of the types of disputes?
Mediation is mediation, whether it is domestic or international. What you will have is a difference in the parties who are involved. You may have a difference in the level of sophistication of the parties. You may have a difference in the level, in the quantum of disputes to be resolved and so on. But at the core, the basic requirements are typically the same. The basic ways of doing things are typically the same. And it is also true that on domestic practice in the area of ADR generally has typically drawn from best practice, which is global in nature. So you tend to see something and say, this is what is happening in a global context. How do we then take it and reflect it in how we operate domestically? And let me use arbitration, for example, which is a good one. If you think about those countries which have signed on to the New York Convention for the Recognition and Enforcement of Arbitral Awards, right? For an arbitral awards. If you get to that and look at that convention, what it does do is that it says that countries or jurisdictions that are parties to this convention agree for the mutual recognition and enforcement of awards made in one country. So let's say an award is made in a jurisdiction which is a New York Convention country, being Jamaica, and Jamaica actually is one such country. There's a recognition that if an award is similarly made in Spain, that an award made in Spain in a New York Convention country may be enforced in Jamaica, subject to the provisions of that convention. And the provisions really set out that there's a limited basis on which you can challenge the award, and those are set out for. So what you have happening in those instances is that whatever you do, you must, at domestic level, try to ensure that your awards are dealt with if they could have this sort of international impact across borders, that they meet not just your domestic requirements, but the same sort of requirements that would enable them for them to be enforced in another jurisdiction.
Right.
So you, by that method, you're having an equalization and a harmonization of global practices in the area of ADR.
Awesome. So when we talk about the global practices, Dr. Malcolm, back in May 2021, the Jamaica International Arbitration Center, JIAC, launched the iNeutral online platform. And we're going to take a look at a short clip from that launch.
Congratulations to the Jamaica International Arbitration Center on the launch of the iNeutral platform. An exciting day, no doubt, for the Arbitration Center and for parties who need assistance in resolving their disputes. Last year, at one of the Arbitration Center's Coffee Time webinar series, I spoke about the pros and cons of online dispute resolution. It has increased access to justice through remote and virtual technology. It is cheaper and faster. There is a notable reduction in backlog, and speedy decision-making processes are ensured. But on the other hand, in some jurisdictions, many issues persist, as claimants and respondents lack adequate skills to participate in the process, especially in developing economies such as the Caribbean, where there's an added difficulty of securing and maintaining expensive digital tools. So here at the Caribbean Bank, we are very keen to ensure that vulnerable people in the region benefit from the democratization of technology, that the justice gaps are closed and no litigant is left behind. So we look forward to the iNeutral web-based platform being used in a spirit of cooperation and as an easy to access and low-cost tool to empower people in the region to pursue early resolutions to their disputes and preserve relationships.
I am extremely pleased to participate in today's launch of what is a unique and innovative online dispute resolution platform for the resolution of conflicts, which will enable persons to resolve their disputes or conflicts without having to engage litigation in the courts. Previously, after careful review of the system for the administration of justice in Jamaica, I came to the considered conclusion that the court system would be greatly assisted by complementary alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Presently, I have become even more convinced that complementary ADR services are required if the need for timely and efficient outcomes is to be prioritized. I strongly believe that the alternative justice services is a major solution towards supporting the reduction of case backlog and daily heavy caseload in our courts, and also to address the underlying social issues which give rise to tensions, conflicts, and crime in our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past year, I have been encouraging our judges to refer applicable cases to ADR, such as restorative justice, mediation, and child diversion programs.
I know you learned a lot from that clip, and I learned a lot when I was doing the launch. Dr. Malcolm, how do you feel when you saw it all coming together and all the feedback that you got from the participants involved on the day of the launch?
The launch day was a good one, if I were to say so. And the reason for that is that while you put all the plans you can in place for an event, and you take all the best step measures that you know how to, you're always wanting to see what ultimately happens at the day of any launch. And I think for us, by the time we got there, we were ourselves satisfied that from a technical perspective, we had developed something that was very good and that would be able to serve not just a regional and domestic market well, but to be able to serve the globe. But on the day, what we saw was a demonstration event that showed that what we thought and had conceived, in fact, was able to apply at the level we wanted it to. We also had persons from across the globe who had had their own previews of what we had developed. And they, having tested in their own way, were satisfied that it was something which had great promise and was working. And they too spoke about it, some of them anyway, on the day of the launch, and the level at which they spoke and the expressions they had about what they thought the good benefits were. It was certainly worth hearing. I mean, you can't pay for that kind of confidence being reposed. And so for us, what it also did was to say to us, now that we've had this level of confidence expressed by reference to what we have done, it now behoves us to ensure that going forward, we're able to maintain a level of quality that is indicative of what we have promised. Mm-hmm. And that is what we continue to do. And that is what we're still working on, because there's nothing ever that is launched and that's the end of a process. There's always ongoing change, ongoing adaptations, and so on. And we continue to do that. But at the moment, we are even happier to say that we are seeing the end result of end users being parties, using the system and being comfortable with it. And so we are now smiling even more that we not only had an idea that we conceived, we were prepared enough, and we did in fact invest time and effort in getting it to market. And we have now seen, or we're now seeing, evolving and emerging market usage of persons who are saying we're comfortable with what has been presented to us.
And a lot of the feedback that I remember getting from the participants is that this was something that was needed. So they were all excited about the fact that this is actually happening, and a lot of countries that needed this kind of management. That came out a lot in what your participants had to say.
Yes, and that too was clear. And the other thing I think which came out as well was the fact that it was a genuine innovation. That while there are systems out there, this presented iNeutral, and we're speaking about iNeutral, of course. iNeutral presented a unique innovation, unique to our circumstances, but nevertheless adaptable and made for use in the world. It's across the world. So while it was born out of our unique experiences, it was also born out of a level of interaction with, collaboration with, and support from persons and end users and practitioners from across the globe who were able to feed their own thoughts into. And the process and the development of iNeutral benefited from those fed-in thoughts. And the end result is showing that.
And now we have this. What advice would you give the persons who are looking to engage in the process of management, dispute management in this digital age with this platform?
Well, the advice is to, like anything else, you need to consider the options that are available. You need to consider what your real needs are, and then to make a mature and well-considered decision of what will suit you best in any situation. And you need also to bear in mind that online is merely a space for doing something. It does not replace the underlying processes that you can then engage in. Because what all online does, is that it allows you to take what you would otherwise have done in a physical space into an online space. So it's a question of space, not a question of modality. In a physical way, you can conduct arbitrations, you can conduct mediations, you can conduct conciliations, you can conduct anything you can think of. Those same processes you can then package and take into the online and manage it there. And that is what iNeutral does, is that it allows you to take your processes with you, to take the rules. Of course, when you go online, there are rules of engagement which will differ simply because the space changes. And there's nothing strange about that. If you were to live in country X and you go to country Y, which, for example, may have a completely different religious system and so on and so forth, you are going to see modes of doing things which are a little different than the way you are used to in your own country. But the overall position that the country is there to serve the needs of its inhabitants and to allow them to function will not change from one country to another. So the end results and the end goals are typically the same. But the way you get there can be a little different. So it's the same thing. In a physical space, because you're able to eyeball each other, there is that engagement which is developed, bearing in mind that you can observe demeanor in a particular way and so on and so forth. When you go online, the question is, how do you ensure that your same concerns, for example, for being able to observe the demeanor of a witness, your same concerns, for example, of allowing fair and equitable treatment, your same concerns, for example, of ensuring that you do not have third parties undisclosed, informing the process, informing a witness and so on. How do you ensure that you protect that? So when you go online, if you go, for example, to a courtroom, the likelihood of a witness sitting in a witness box being coached by somebody else as to what to say is not as real as somebody sitting in a remote location 10,000 miles away from you, where you are, where you can have a physical system put in place, and you can have a space where somebody may well be sitting in an adjoining room, somebody may well be in the same room, and because of how you manage it, then information flows across. So what you want to have happening at all times is that you know that when you're online, the security features have to be increased.
Right.
And measures must be deliberately taken to ensure that there's no undue influence coming to bear. So those are some of the things that you have to take there. But it doesn't change the fact that you're still dealing with mediation, you're still dealing with arbitration, you're still dealing with conciliation and all these things. But you have to take sometimes added measures to ensure that the process is not corrupted.
Oh, well, that is very important. So also, how important do you believe it is for persons to have access to dispute management online? How important do you think that is?
Well, it's important for persons to have access to dispute management, period. And the reason for this, as I have been saying throughout this podcast series, is that we live in a society and we live knowing that teeth and tongue, as we say in Jamaica, will always meet. There will always be cause for, and there will always be conflicts and disputes which need to be managed. So the management of them is something that you must always plan for. Online now takes you to the space of not necessarily whether or not you should plan for them in the first place, but whether or not you can use the availability of a process which can be had more easily in many instances to allow you to have this dispute management. And why do I say that? If you were to think even at a purely domestic level, let's forget the international and cross-border for the minute. Let's say we lived together in the Bahamas. Let's just use it as a country. And there are persons, you know, the Bahamas is made up of several islands. And let's say their main court is in Nassau. Let's just say that for the minute. And you have proceedings there, and persons now have to travel from various parts of various islands to get there for proceedings. What it means is that you will have to physically transport yourself there in one way or another to be able to participate in what is a purely physical process. But let's just say you were to take that same process and enable it to be managed online. What then do you have? The person can sit in whichever of the islands he or she is in and still connect into a real-time process enabled by technology that will allow you to get to dealing with the problem. Are there limitations? Clearly there are. But are there benefits? Yes, there certainly are as well. So the question is, how do you encourage persons to say, look, there are some things where you can have significant benefits to be derived from being online. Let us see how we can use that, and let us see also how we may be able to use it to ensure that more and more people have access to the means of resolving their disputes. A cross-border practice for international arbitration and so on is notoriously expensive if you have large matters with people traveling from multiple jurisdictions to any particular place to have their matters resolved. Airfares, hotel accommodation, all the other things that go with it. The question is there a way that you can minimize some of that? And for those of us who are interested in climate change, there is also the whole idea of going green. The less travel you have to do is the less of a carbon footprint you have. So online also allows you in that space to say, let us see how we can minimize unnecessary travel. Let us see how we can minimize unnecessary use of people. And by that process, start something which is much greener and ends up having to use less paper and so on than possible.
So, Doc, in regards to how do you encourage persons who I'm here in Jamaica and somebody else is in the States, and for them to feel that doing it digitally will make them get the best effectiveness in terms of arbitration mediation, doing it through the digital space?
Well, the starting point for me is, how do you ensure that you're able to get a dispute managed in a physical space in circumstances where you cannot travel?
Right.
And that's a significant factor. I may have said it in almost a glib way, but it is not. Because if you remember, and still now, there are travel restrictions that are all over the place, but notwithstanding that there are restrictions in place, there's still disputes, some of which arose before the pandemic. And those persons still require to have their disputes resolved. So for me, there's an element of it where you're able to say to persons, look, this is your practical alternative. Because you are going to be waiting, if you say you're going to do that, on the pandemic ending and you're being able to go back. But what we do know is that we've seen countries come out of lockdown, go back into lockdown, and we really are in a state of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what process, if any, is there that we can rely upon for some level of certainty? And the truth be told is that however much we may not want to go online, online does provide a level of certainty for connection. So that is one benefit of it. The other benefit of it, the other thing to bear in mind that we're going there, for persons who may be hesitant to say, well, going online will not allow me the level of interaction I need. I, for example, like when I'm cross-examining a witness to stare them in the face and to watch their demeanor. And I like to watch my tribunal to see where their hand is writing and how they're writing and all that. Persons may say that. But the truth be told, having myself been involved in arbitrations in an online space, international ones, both as arbitrator and as counsel for parties, I know that there are things you can do which, interestingly enough, will allow you to have access and to see sometimes even more. I've heard fellow practitioners say that they have found that with the proper use of technology, you can, by reference to how images are positioned, be able to have an even greater view of the process than you would in a purely physical space. So it's a question of management and a question of what we do. But I think the clincher at the end of the day always for me is, what then is the alternative? And I think in many instances, the only real alternative, at least for now, in this era of uncertainty, is for us to use online in the way that we can, and to the extent that we're able to, in a hybridized way with physical processes.
Awesome. So, Doc, before we wrap up, can you let our viewers and our listeners know how they can contact the JIAC and the services online?
To see what the JIAC offers, persons are able to go to the website of the JIAC, which is jaiac.org. And they may also telephone the JIAC at 876-416-5390. And this can be done by persons from anywhere at all in the world.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doc. And as we wrap up, like we did in the beginning, we wrap up with the repeat of today's quote. Throughout centuries, men of law have been persistently concerned about the resolution of disputes in ways that enable society to achieve its goals with a minimum of force and a maximum of reasoning. I'm Roxene Nickle, and on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm and our production team, thank you for tuning in.
This program is produced with the kind sponsorship of the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Special thanks to ADEB Consultants Limited, consulting engineers practicing for over 40 years. iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy. CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution Limited, CIADR. Mona Law Faculty, the University of the West Indies, Mona. Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean. All our podcast episodes are distributed by these platforms: Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.